Greetings and welcome back to another iteration of MGTOW Talks. I am here with none other than High Lord Biochemist by popular demand, and we are here to talk about something that is quite possibly the most important thing we could be talking about. Very much related to the topic we had previously covered in the MGTOW Talks Emergent Property of Self and Origin. We're going to continue this. We're going to go into greater depth. And hopefully, we'll be able to shine some light into the corridors of darkness. So, with that said, I will let the High Lord of Biochemistry take the reins.
Well, so this conversation started a few days ago where I had started asking you just a line of questions where really I wanted to know why it was that you did what you did. Like why do you do this? Why do you why pull back the veil? Why push the darkness a little bit further and increase human understanding? Like why be a thinking ape in the first place?
Hmm.
And eventually it got to this point where you were telling me essentially that you wanted to dispel a lot of myths, which you found very harmful. And you brought up a conversation that you had on TeamSpeak with someone you were playing a game with, and
Yeah.
he had mentioned. Well, would you want to tell the story?
Yeah, sure. I'll just. This is sort of my signature story, but I've experienced not dissimilar sort of stories. So, guy I play a game with sometimes got on conversation. Sometimes, of course, conversations move away from the game, turn to some other topic. Anyway, long story short, we started talking about fat people, specifically obese people, and he made the comment, I hate fat people. I hate their lack of willpower. This, mind you, had not been the first time I had heard such an utterance. I've heard these things all the time. I've seen them on the internet, etc. And so I thought I could be engaged in sort of educational activity, perhaps, and try to illustrate some points. So I said, okay, hear me out here. There are a couple of points I'd like to make. Number one, do you really think someone chooses to be 400 pounds? I mean, knowing the complete lack of benefits, the social state of being a pariah, the health, the damage to the health, the all these things that one assumes when one quote unquote chooses to weigh 400 pounds. Why would anyone do that? More importantly, I was willing to offer him two hypothetical different scenarios, seemingly different scenarios. Two individuals, they both weigh 400 pounds approximately. In case A, the guy has an endocrine malfunction, something hormonal, and it's demonstrable, and in all likelihood, this is what the cause of his eating problems are and his inability to metabolize things. In case B, we can't see any or detect any hormonal issue. There's no endocrine issue. It seems to be something in his quote unquote head. And I said, well, given these two different cases, examples, how do you feel about what would you say that? Well, obviously in case A, it's not his fault, so I don't feel that hatred. I feel kind of, I guess, a sense of sympathy a little bit. I certainly don't feel this anger, this sort of anger, this hostility. But obviously, in case B, if he doesn't have a hormonal problem, he's choosing to do this. It's just, he said, this typical exact kind of lack of willpower that I just hate. And I like to call this the neck down fallacy. I've kind of come up with this. It's basically entails the idea that everything from the neck down is somehow not our quote unquote fault. The minute we start talking about everything from the neck upwards, and the brain, basically, the seat of consciousness, this assumes a whole new level of personal responsibility, self authorship, self creation, blame, guilt, praiseworthiness, and the lack thereof, etc. And yeah, that's this was this conversation.
And I would add independence,
Oh
people
yeah,
feeling that they have in the self-authorship that they are the sole author of themselves, of their lives,
yep, yep,
which is entirely false. Because I mean, For instance, imagination is a wonderful thing. I love it. Being able to go into the mind, to play with one's concept of reality, and copy what one sees and then make tweaks to it. It's a wonderful human capability. But even imagination is limited. So, for instance, I have a hard time imagining what a zero gravity environment would feel like. I've been in water, so I can kind of understand weightlessness. I've been in free fall from, like, say, being on a roller coaster ride, but I can't really wrap my mind around living in a zero gravity environment. In fact, I take gravity as being entirely granted in all of my thoughts and all of my imagination. It's just this thing which doesn't really occur to me. And really, this is the environment in which we live. If we lived on a lower gravity planet, I'm sure my imagination would be different. But really, even something as seemingly unlimited, as seemingly free as imagination, has some real limitations on it, placed upon us by our circumstance, placed upon us by our environment, our biology, things which we may not be aware of, which we simply take for granted. Uh, and people have an interesting, uh, I guess, ability to lie to themselves that they are freer than they are.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I think that it's one of those either or things. Ultimately, we're either free or we're not. And as we'll be talking about, I think all the evidence points to not being free. But there's some quality about the mind. I like to use the German term rarely. I'm not a fan of using borrowed words, but the Geist, which is this incorporation of spirit and mind, that there's something about that is non-physical. It's I think it's the non-physicality, at least the perception of it, that gives people this inclination to think, to make reference to the examples again. In case A, it's a hormonal issue, so he's gets off scot free, as it were. Not his fault. But if it's something that resides in the Geist, in the mind, it's something else. Even though at the same time you can point out that the brain is a physical a physical organ, and yeah, you're
and subject to stimuli which are physical in their origin.
laws of physics and all that stuff. So it's just that in case B, the guy with which seems some what you could probably rightly call a neurological dysfunction. We don't know what it is. We don't know as yet how to identify that. Now, I mentioned previously we were chatting. Maybe in 40 years' time, we're going to have super MRI machines that can say, "Oh yeah, that's this thing going on in the neocortex. That's what's going on." And if we can modify that, then you're going to stop overeating and blah 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 blah. I mean, maybe we'll get there. Maybe we won't. But the idea that that's somehow separate from the neck down fallacy, that this is somehow applicable, is ludicrous.
And there are some very interesting implications which you brought up, especially for the moralization that occurs,
Mm.
that arises from this sense of agency. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think
so,
we need to, in the broadest sense, before proceeding, we should talk about basically what we are talking about now. This causa sui, the self cause, this idea of being free agents. Now, despite what some philosophers claim, you can't really get a little bit of freedom, or some freedom or a lot of freedom. We're either free agents or we're not, and both have immense implications. If we're free agents, which is a really nebulous term, that is free to choose anything, free from constraints, then yeah, then we can attribute blame and we can be hateful and we can do all of this stuff. And if we're not, then many consequences arise from that. It's just that in a universe that is deterministic, and we can talk about the indeterministic stuff as well. Everything has some prior cause. Your existence has a prior cause. Your current state has a prior cause, and all we have is biology and environment and the interaction between the two. Would you
right.
like?
in some way, the Causa Sui is a rejection of causation or cause and effect, the logical progression of reality as we know it.
Oh, absolutely. It's a kind of temporary shutting down of just a basic principle of human reality. Now, before we proceed, this probably should just be briefly covered. Many people in defense of a philosophical libertarian position, that is the idea that we have a free will, a free choice, free to do otherwise kind of notion. They will bring up something such as quantum indeterminacy. Now, there are a couple of points to be made here. One is that chaos, randomness, does not beget free choice. If you are the product of, if even if we were to assume that this is not the case, there's no evidences, but let's assume that quantum events, indeterminate events, were the major contributors to human behavior. You're not consciously aware of this. It's random. You have no control over it. You're still not getting this classic idea of an uncaused self. And more to the point, although I'm not a physicist, I have taken the time to look this up and research it extensively. Physicists identify a move from the quantum state of the universe to the classical Newtonian one called decoherence. And human behavior, the vast majority of which, there's some debate at the neuronal level that might not be, but even then we get back to the chaos thing, that takes place in the classical Newtonian universe. So, there's cause everywhere. If there's cause everywhere, then the idea of self authorship, I'm me without anything attached to it, and thus all the consequences and actions that you engage in, this sort of falls apart. Well, it doesn't just sort of; it does completely fall apart. So, yeah.
Yeah. And to tie this back into the theme of the previous discussion, the origins of the self, there is the fact that we are constrained, even if we are within a range of probabilities. If there is a suite of, if you want to call it choice, available to us, or a population set of things which are available for us to choose, to use the parlance that is so common, it is still bounded by causality. You still have to live within the physical world. There's no libertarian free will.
Bound. Sorry, I'm a stickler. Bound by.
Thank you.
It's okay. This particular one drives me crazy. This bounded means something very different. Anyway, proceeding onwards. This is I was caused by powers beyond myself to correct you. I'm sorry about that. In any
Right.
event,
Well, your environment had put you into
yeah,
a studying of languages,
yeah.
and so
No. But yeah, this is a problem because going back to the example of the guy that I sometimes game with, and he's saying, "Oh, I hate fat people." How can this hatred be justified or make any sense if in a universe without free choice? If it's demonstrably so, and I think it is, that the guy with the neuronal issue as opposed to the hormonal issue, the below the neck issue, he no more chooses that state than the guy with the below the neck issue. The hatred is not only not justified, it's just nonsense. It's misplaced, and it's a waste of energy. And
and go ahead.
no, please.
And because it's misplaced, you can't do anything with it. It's fighting shadows essentially, and it's a waste of time because you'll get your blood pressure raised about all these fat lazy people, but you're getting worked up about something that's nonsense.
Yeah. I think this is, I mean, the immediate benefit to recognizing that we are not causes, that we exist as a consequence of biology and environment and the interaction between the two, and these are not within our control, is that there are a lot of superfluous emotions that we feel, for example, anger and hatred, that aren't beneficial, that you just immediately feel almost necessitated to let go of. I know I have, since over the years as I've developed a greater understanding of this, to the point where I just it's almost impossible to get me truly angry about things. I think because I understand how the world works and how particularly the universe works and how human beings work. We were talking before about getting angry at objects, right? For example, stubbing your toe and getting angry at the table, not particularly rational. Whereas we engage a kind of intellectual doublespeak with ourselves. The guy who spills coffee on you, though, that's different, right? And you can get angry at him, even if he apologizes profusely. There's a objects don't have agency, but human beings do, I mean we let's define what agency is here. I mean, it's people do take action. We do things, and our actions have effects on others. It's just that the how we arrive at these actions, these are not these don't this doesn't arrive this doesn't come out of thin air. It's not just I just
The self in a
instantaneously.
package.
Yeah, that's just not how it works. Maybe since you talked extensively about the anger issue, we can expand upon that.
Yeah. So, I mean, anger, it really evolved to keep us away from charging bears, let's say, or something to help us fight. And it had a real survival advantage to it. But if you're getting angry sitting in the middle of traffic, to borrow, sorry, the Sapolsky's example of being angry, stuck in traffic at a red light. If you're getting angry, the light won't turn green. All you're doing is raising your blood pressure. You're sitting down in a very comfortable environment. You're well fed. You're not starving. You're not threatened. And yet you've got all these stress hormones running through your blood, uh, and metabolizing glycogen and giving you all of the energy you need to run from a bear when
Yeah.
you're just waiting at a red light. And so I mean that's the example that Sapolsky gives,
Hmm.
because he's the primatologist that studies stress hormones
Yeah.
and referenced plenty of times in previous talks. But the anger developed for a purpose which we're not really using it for. We're turning it toward abstractions. We're turning it toward things which are not really their proper object. So if you're angry at a guy who spills coffee on you, for example, the example you gave, what are you really being angry at? The random happenstance of the universe, the chaos of someone turning around at that instant, that happenstance of him holding a coffee and it unfortunately spilling all over you. I mean, you're getting angry at something which really you can't fix, you can't discharge. And the problem with that is that if you can't discharge your anger toward its rightful object, you're going to be angry in perpetuity, because you'll always be missing the target. You'll always uh, be worked up, and as you pointed out, you have a hard time being angry because you don't attribute uh, culpability, I guess you'd say, to
Hmm.
the guy that just happened to turn around at the wrong time in the
No,
wrong place.
it's unfortunate. It's disappointing. I mean, I'm not. I think disappointment's still an appropriate response sometimes, because it's. I think disappointments might be almost impossible to get rid of. It's natural to feel that way, but anger, on the other hand, it really is. I mean, I no more attribute culpability to the guy who spills coffee on me than I can to, well, the traffic light that won't turn, stubbing my toe on a table, a snake that happened to bite me. It's just it's pretty silly when you actually think about it. But human beings run on rather guttural, instinctively primed modes of fixed action patterns. I mean, it's basically a fixed action pattern. Something bad happens, you feel a surge of adrenaline, and anger ensues, and But it's possible actually to regulate that and to modify it to the point where it just doesn't really have a place.
And
As
as you say, recline into your mind.
Yeah, I like to use the term recline into my mind frequently because I think that's really what it comes down to. If you understand how the universe works, then you're going to understand that people are not self authors. The guy who spills coffee on you, even if he, for example, there are two instances. He spills coffee on you, apologize profusely. You might be more inclined to forgive him in a conventional sense. But what if he's just, he just laughs at you? Look, I spilled coffee on you. We seem to make some sort of distinction there, right? But as far as the guy being a sort of uncaused self, whatever events, physical events that led up to the event of him spilling coffee on you, whether it seems malicious or not, I mean, that's what happened, and it was outside of his control. And your experience of having coffee spilled on you was also outside of your control and his control. I mean, either way, whether you see him from a malicious perspective or not, it's the same result.
So why are we talking about this? This is a very important topic, and it's kind of it seems like a trivial example, right? A guy spilling
Yeah,
coffee,
yeah,
but
yeah.
it has much wider implications than even the examples we're giving. So, for instance, the below the neck versus the above the neck thing. One of the examples I'd like to bring into this is the culpability, for instance, male sexuality. And it's something that people get a lot of shit for in society. Is a very natural biological urge to procreate. I think that's a fairly common thing, especially younger men, boys. They're horny, and for some reason we give them culpability for something that's entirely hormonal, and yet we wouldn't give someone who had like uh, let's say hmm, uh, a cancer of their endocrine system be sarcoma. I think sarcoma is for endocrine tissues as well. I have to look at that. But if they had a disease state, you wouldn't give them blame. But if they had something that was a little less of a disease state, let's say the obesity example, where it's above the neck, you would give them culpability.
Hmm.
So there are much wider implications than just.
Well, I think that this is possibly the most important topic one can discuss. I mean, for years now, the topic of free will. I mean, this is what this comes down to has been the province of academics exclusively, and not so much in recent years whether or not there's free will. Most people have given up what's called the libertarian bent. That is, there's free choice, but all the variations that come after that. But in the public domain, in the layperson, in common everyday discourse, the conventional line of thought is that we are indeed free agents. There's a such thing as a self-made man. I mean, one of the things that I positively can't stand about the American dream, the idea, is it's foundational to the American dream to believe in a freedom of choice that simply is not present, a freedom of choice that allows individuals to bypass their biology and environment in a way that would be, in all likelihood, the property of a god, right? It doesn't map onto reality, and yet it's something that's so well perceived and well appreciated in society. When we offer praise, and we talked about this the other day, the guy who's really fit or the guy who's extremely wealthy, we offer him praise. Likewise, the guy who's a crack addict, the guy who's a criminal, the guy who's obese, in both cases, we're attributing an agency there, a power that none of these individuals I just mentioned actually have. But it could be used positively or negatively. But whether it's positive or negative, it's still false.
Right. Sorry, real quick. I made a mistake and I wanted to correct myself. It's a carcinoma, not a sarcoma.
Okay,
The
no,
cancer.
no problem. Yeah, no problem.
I I would feel bad if I left that uncorrected. But getting back to what you just said. Sorry, could you please continue?
Yeah, no, I was just pointing out that the reason why this is such an important topic to discuss is because the conventional notion that people have that we are somehow free agents is just foundational to so many beliefs in our society, particularly in American society, of which I'm no longer part. But still, there is a notion of this, and I do want to bring up antiquity. There are many, many false views of the world that arose during antiquity. We have progressed in many ways a great deal since then. But there were some views of the world and the universe that were correct. I mean, let's take astrology, for example. Astrology almost certainly is not an actual map of human behavior. But there is a sense of correctness in it, in that astrology attributes to human behavior something greater than the self. There's something out there working itself upon you. Now, of course, as I said, it's almost certainly incorrect, but there's an idea that there's something, not a god per se, but there are forces out there beyond your control that are leading you to be what you are. And in antiquity, it was the same thing. Even the rather anthropomorphic gods of ancient Greece, I mean, they were fickle, but they ruled the universe. And we were unfortunately not but objects to be acted upon by the gods. And the idea of propitiating the forces of nature, etc. But of course, none of this has an actual effect on mitigating the forces of nature. But there was a distinct feeling of there is a universe out there beyond our control, and it is acting upon us. And sometimes, and it's actually all the time, but sometimes the perception was we are mere pawns of this. Now, there would not be a Stoic school, a Stoic school of philosophy, had this not been the case. Now, Stoicism was in large measure a response to a deterministic universe. And the Stoics had actually rightly distinguished fatalism from determinism. There's a lot of confusion when it comes to this, by the way, that to exist in a deterministic universe is to accept the cause of fatalism. I believe it was Chrysippus, who was probably the most prominent Stoic philosopher, 3rd century BCE, who brought this up. The fatalist claims, well, if you get sick, you shouldn't, you just don't see a doctor because you're going to die. But determinism is quite the opposite. The determinist believes that we exist in a causal chain, meaning if you get sick, this is the causal chain which will lead you to see a doctor who will heal you. It's quite the opposite of, oh, this is just the way it is. So, perception in antiquity in general was just, I think, just much more precise, in some respects at least, of how we interact as conscious, intelligent beings with the universe. Along came Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, and a lot of this stuff, I think, can be well, I don't like to lay blame at, but a lot of the perceptions we have can be assigned to this idea of, quote unquote, this deity bestowing free will, whatever that means, upon man, and blah, blah, blah. The criminal justice system, everything we have in modern Western society, particularly in the Anglosphere, that is the United States, Canada, UK, etc., it's just foundational to believe in a self-authored you that exists outside the boundaries of environment and biology.
And
And
there's sorry,
no, go on,
that
please.
reality bifurcates, and
Yeah.
that you have this split of dualism. That there is a, you know, let's say a Cartesian dualism with the mind and the body, and that. Go ahead.
No, I agree. I mean, part of the problem here is a dualistic perspective. I mean, this has been talked about with regards to, say, gynocentrism, where at some point in time it becomes a social thing. But as I pointed out just previously, as we were revving up for the talk, even if you were to grant that 100% of all human behavior is environment and there's no biology, that's tantamount to you being a ball in a pinball machine being knocked about to and fro in every direction you can imagine. That's not giving you self-authorship. So that argument falls apart as well. The idea of sort of dividing yourself into two, though, that if you have
That's
some sort,
arbitrary.
it's arbitrary, and if you have the idea that you have some sort of Geist, this sort of free floating thing that exists outside of the causal laws of the universe, then yeah, I mean, in theory, you can be a self-caused self. It's just that there's no evidence to suggest that. I mean, it's an interesting thought experiment, but it should become patently obvious. But everything that you are now, you the listener, everything you are now is the product of an event beyond you. The genetics that contributed to you, the environment, etc. You've done none of that. And thus, the idea of even taking credit for things, I know it feels good to do so, but if you notice, I'm always reluctant to take credit for anything. You know, when I.M. was praising me, I didn't really like accepting that because, you know, everything I do is just the consequence of the interaction of my biology with the environment. I don't think it should be depreciated, but I don't think it should be praised without reason.
Now, for me, this is a little bit uncomfortable because there's a desire to have these fictions because
Hmm.
wouldn't it be nice to have the praise? Wouldn't it be nice if you had more agency and you could do more about the world you live in? So letting go of these things for me can be kind of uncomfortable because go ahead.
Absolutely. And I want to just talk about what you're talking about right now. I mean, in the academic camp, which unfortunately this is the province of academics still. I aim to change that. Once you not talking about the libertarians who still very minority camp there, but the people who accept that there's no such thing as free choice, there's an entire camp of academics they're called the illusionists who think that, well, yeah, it's all bullshit and there's no free will, but we can't let people know. You know, it'll have a detrimental effect on society. Now, I should make reference to previous notions, say in the 18th and the 17th century, when people began to appreciate the idea that there probably isn't this monotheistic God, and if there is, it was some sort of deistic version. But you know, we can't let the quote unquote little people know because you know chaos will ensue or what have you. And these people, who some people term the illusionists, they they think that the illusion is so important that it must be maintained. But
And so they have a noble lie.
well, that's exactly what it is. I mean, it's the same. It's the noble. This was the term used in the 18th century as well by certain intellectuals. The noble lie of God. In this case, it's in the more modern context, the noble lie of free will. The masses need it, and there's a sort of arrogance behind that. This idea that people are just too stupid to apprehend something that's so basic, which I don't think is the case, but that they just have to have it. Now, the problem with this is that there's a lot of negative stuff that comes with the noble lie. There's blame, there's self-loathing, self-hatred, there's hatred towards other people, there's intolerance. There's so many negatives that come from it that whatever valuables we might take from it, this idea of being praised, we can substitute that. For example, someone says, you've done X, Y, Z really well, you should be praised, and that can merely be appreciated. That's without turning it into a sort of ego-centered, oh, I did this kind of thing, but rather, this is something that benefits me, benefits other people. It can be appreciated. So I think we can substitute certain things, but there's too much of a negative that comes from, say, the illusionist camp, that it must be maintained despite it not being legitimate. That's my view, at least.
If you'd indulge me in a quick tangent about the etymology of the noble lie, the cognate noble has gnosis, or to know, like not in the sense of nobility as in those of righteous birth or whatnot, but the idea that some things can be known or that there is this knowledge which is
Does it? I'm not sure. I mean, I would have to look it up. I don't know the specific. I know it comes from Latin nobis. I'm not sure if it's directly related to gnosis, though. It might be, but I wouldn't. I'm not sure about that. If you know for a
I
fact, though, then please correct me.
I looked it up a
Okay,
couple of
so it's
weeks ago.
related to gnosis. Okay, interesting. Yeah.
And it's the idea that there's a class of people who know better than us, or that they,
Ah,
they
yes.
perpetrate the noble lie, or that they perpetrate the lie of nobility, or that there's a class of agency, or that they are, the mouthpiece of God or something like this.
Right. Yeah,
And,
that makes
and
sense, and I also recognize, from a linguistic perspective, the loss of consonants before nasals. Anyway, yep, in Latin, yep, it makes sense. Yeah,
no, I
absolutely.
thought that was an interesting little thing to add to
Yeah,
the
yeah. I
discussion.
mean, certainly, in this case, it does bear direct relevance. But the noble lie can take many forms. But yeah, they used to do it with religion, with God, and these days, academics who hang out in their hallowed halls tend to do it with the issue of free will,
So,
desert that is deserving things, punishment, blameworthiness, etc.
right, and it is this kind of sophistry. They posture themselves as knowing something more, or that they, that there are certainly limits to human understanding, and that if you are this kind of godlike figure where you have this agency that you can change the environment which you live in, I mean, you do have some capacity
No,
for
we
doing
as I
this.
mentioned in the case of the sick guy who sees a doctor. I mean, to say that you're sick, you should just die. That's fatalism. Determinism says you're sick, but if you see a doctor, there's a high probability of you being healed or cured. Of course, we have an impact. I mean, we this conversation will have some sort of causal impact on some members of the audience to varying degrees, and vice versa. It's I mean, there's no doubt. I don't know if I would call that agency though, so much as we are we aren't self causes, but we are part of the contributing cause to well that which lies outside of us.
Like the previous conversation, which we spent so much time qualifying the words we were using, I'm kind of stuck with the language. So
Yeah, yeah, no, I get it.
unfortunately, yeah, I'm
We
going to
we
use words like agency. But getting back to what I was saying about the noble lie and the sophistry, the posturing, uh, it's it's this idea that they have more agency than they actually do, the hyper agency, I guess.
yeah,
And and so it it's interesting because if they posture themselves as being the know-it-alls, well, there are some interesting implications to that. One is that if you think you know everything, you tend not to ask questions, and you tend not to get into interesting discussions like the ones we're having. And some of the most powerful thoughts come from saying, "I don't know."
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
so,
absolutely.
and when we have the humility, I guess, I would say a lot of what we're talking about can be related to humility. When we have the humility to say, I don't know, that opens up the conversation for things like, well, how do we find out? What can we change? What is it really that we have power over? And what is it we don't have power over? But if we delude ourselves, we'll never be sure. We'll always think that we'll have more power than we actually do, or less power than we actually do. And we'll never get to the root cause of things. And so the noble lie that say that we know things that we don't know, it's very detrimental for seeking knowledge. Right.
Yeah, I think, and I get the impression as someone who's a concerned yet very interested lay person in the whole free will discussion, not the debate. There's no debate really, but the what happens after the fact. That I have the feeling that people want to kind of just hoard it to themselves. The discussion, it just sort of has no place in public discourse, and the consequences, as I said, are just immense. When we no longer accept as valid. The idea that we are causes, there's no such thing as a self-made man, for example. The idea, when we factually reject the idea that the opportunities are endless, as the conservative Charles Murray claims, for example, when we reject the idea that anyone can be anything, this, or even the idea that one thing people when you criticize the American dream, they'll say, well, it's symbolic of having the opportunity, but the opportunity is not always there, even with the quote unquote American dream. I pointed out, for example, the distinction between two identical individuals, say biologically, genetically identical. One grows up in some poor mining town in West Virginia. The other grows up in an upper class apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. They're going to have very different opportunities afforded them, despite having identical biology. The opportunities are not endless. They're not equal. Not everyone has the same access. And we would do well to disabuse ourselves of this view. First off, we would be more compassionate towards people. We would be more compassionate towards ourselves. We would be less harsh. I seem to recall reading a comment made by one of my subscribers, and I've heard similar things. He talked about his alcoholism and how once he began to grasp these concepts that he started fighting it a lot less. And eventually he was able to, at least for some period now, I think it's 2 years, to overcome it. Because it wasn't seen so much as a conflict, so much as something that simply was. And there are many advantages to adapting essentially a fact-based view of the reality we live in. And I think this is possibly the most important talk we can have, at least in public discourse, because so much of politics and even everyday conversation revolves around, who's to blame, who's this, who's that, who's achieved this, who hasn't. And when we understand this, that discussion just doesn't really have a place anymore, and it's an empty discussion.
Right. It's right there in our language even. We have a hard time forming words for some of the concepts that we're trying to discuss.
Yeah.
I mean, agency, for instance. What are we really talking about?
Well, I think we can use maybe the term actors maybe actor is a better word. I'm not really sure. We're stuck with the constraints of human language.
Right. So in the example of someone with alcoholism, once you realize that there is a disease state, well, you can start treating the disease. But if you have this lie, this delusion that it's all in your head or that it is entirely within your control, and you're not going to be treating the rightful object of, well, the disease, right? You're not going to be treating it as you should, or that you would otherwise be doing in a more effectual way. If you sat down and you said, okay, well, what is this? I mean, let's get rid of the delusions of self cause, and let's see. Okay, well, it looks like the population genetics, it turns out there's a higher incidence of alcoholism in certain populations. Okay, what does that tell us? And you just start asking these questions. You start looking at reality until you find the actual cause of things, which becomes a lot more effective in dealing with reality as we know it. But we can never deal with reality effectively if we continue to delude ourselves. I mean, and that's one of the biggest problems of society, is that it has these social fictions, which you mentioned the illusionists. It has maybe a place for some people, but it really, it's like soma. It's a drug that holds us back.
Yeah. Well, look, of course, there's a benefit to having maintaining the noble lie. Specifically in this context, there's a benefit to it. I mean, it feels good to be praised for something that you allegedly have done all by yourself.
Oh, and the group cohesion,
Yeah,
which is an evolutionary advantage that we
yeah.
get, like the noble.
Nationalism, being proud of American achievements, to which you're not related in the slightest. You know.
Right. I mean, did you found the country or whatever, or you'd mentioned Mary Curie? Uh,
Well, I use this example as, I mean, I've seen this actually, men do this as well. It's kind of one thing that's kind of a pet peeve of me, of myself, is, well, there's this, of mine rather. Geez, spending too much time speaking German. Totally so lost in German-esque thought. The idea. So I was talking to Tildeer, and I mentioned that, women seem to sort of see a sort of symbolism in Marie Curie. Marie Curie is the sort of headmistress of chemistry and blah blah blah, and so thus representative of female accomplishments. And then I'll see the same. I don't feel this at all myself, but when some MGTOW men talk about the accomplishments of men, it's done almost certainly with a sort of collective pride, but they have nothing to do with the accomplishments. I don't have anything to do with what Isaac Newton did, or Einstein, or any inventor did, or I mean, it's completely unrelated to me. So, but this applies not just to the, your own sex or gender. It's a very powerful force for nationalism and cohesion, as you mentioned. I mean, let's be proud of the great American accomplishments of, I don't know, hot dogs and football or whatever. It doesn't really
well,
matter what it is. Sending the first man to the moon, for example, right? I mean, there was a group of individuals that succeeded at this, but it becomes a sort of a hallmark of American pride that is totally irrelevant to the masses. They had nothing to do with it, but still,
there's strength in numbers, and that's fair enough. But it's a strength that's based off of a social fiction.
yeah, yeah. And I think that the problem with the noble lie attitude is that it's a lot more deleterious than it's given credit. I think the harm on balance is greater. I mean, we're more inclined to
Rest on our
rest
laurels.
on. Yeah, I think we're more despite what people claim, the idea of determinant, we're more inclined to rest on our laurels, blame people. In fact, there have been studies done by certain psychologists and philosophers. A guy named, I think his name is Bruce Waller. He's done most of it, which seem to imply that the greater the belief in conventional free will, the worse the incarceration rates tend to be. And the United States is a perfect example of this. There need to be more studies done on this. Where we have, I mean, the United States has some of the worst prison setups well, it does, period, of any Western civilized country. And
Talk about implications of this discussion and why it's important. I mean, look at how many men are in jail. In the United
yeah,
States,
yeah,
it's insane.
and
It's
and
worse than the Gulag.
and talk about vindictiveness. A very interesting study. There was actually I'll have to look it up later. The exact name of the council that prison rape towards men has become so commonplace and frequent that it's seen as part of the actual punishment and thus well deserved. That they should be subject to rape in addition to imprisonment. And this comes from a culture of essentially of vindictiveness. When you believe in free will of any sort, particularly of the absolute sort, which is sort of the conventional public opinion, then this opens up a world for, as I said, feeling hatred, retributive justice, retribution, vengeance, vindictiveness. Oh, he got what he deserved, that kind of attitude. But as I pointed out before, there was a prominent example of a serial killer named Robert Harris, who was sexually abused as a child, beaten up, you name it, bullied, everything, had the worst of everything happen, turned out to be a serial killer. Now, admittedly, he's a dangerous guy, but the proper attitude towards a guy like that is, yeah, we might need to incarcerate him and, I don't know, keep him away from people that he's a danger to, but blaming him for his state is silly. Feeling a sense of moral superiority is silly as well. I mentioned before, I'll say it again. When I was very young, I think somewhere I was either 8 or 9, I was with a friend and I wanted to play with his hamster, and he wouldn't let me, and it kind of pissed me off, and he stepped out, And make a long story short, I ended up torturing the hamster and I drowned it in the bathtub eventually, and kind of wasn't exactly a nice thing. And I point this out to say that I have no claim to be in some sort of moral pillar of rectitude, and that many of us, perhaps most of us, maybe even all of us, if we had undergone the same circumstances as a Robert Harris, maybe in all likelihood we probably would be serial killers too. So if we can move away from this mindset, that sort of the moral proselytizing, all of this other crap, which is just it's it's unnecessary baggage. It's enough to say until we can find some way to correct the neurology of this person, he's dangerous, and yeah, for practical reasons, until we can think of something better, we're probably gonna have to lock him up. But all this other shit that accompanies that, we can get rid of it.
Right. And what comes to mind for me are two things. First, I mean, blaming Robert Harris for being abused as a child. I mean, how he turned out as an adult. You know, you're blaming a child for being sexually assaulted, for being beaten up, all these things, and then him acting out. And you know, I don't think that's morally culpable to say that you are the product of your environment. I think that
That's an extreme
and
case, mind you. But the serial killer that seemingly doesn't have that sort of observable causal chain, in reality, he's no different. Just because we can't observe the causes doesn't mean there are not causal events that led up to this particular form of behavior. It's just that we approach this from this sort of they deserve this. There are good and bad people. Whereas, good and bad is essentially a roll of the dice. I mean, the environment you were born into, the genetics, the neurology you were given. Life is a lottery. And it's a lottery that most of us refuse to acknowledge as being such, and it's causing great harm. And we hurt ourselves. I mean, when we struggle against against phantoms, essentially phantasms, we have the self-loathing, we have all these things, all these negatives that come with that. In addition to the outward harm, people seek to place blame on others unnecessarily. This is just, I think it's harmful, and whatever benefits can be had from an illusionist position of the noble lie, it's not worth it. Now there are other positions to consider, such as the attitudinist claim, which is not really an illusionist. It's just that it's sort of incorrigible. That is to say that there's something about it that, and I'm more partial to that. I don't really know, how much of the problems that arise from this perspective are actually corrigible. That is, it can be solved. But I think that most of us have access to viewing the world as it is, and in doing so, it's very difficult to feel a lot of these conventional emotions and feelings that we're so inclined to feel. Yeah.
hmm. Well, the other thing I was going to say was, and it's a little late now, but the quote that it reminded me of with the Robert Harris thing is, I think it was Red Dragon or Hannibal Lecter. He had said, in an enlightened society, they'd put me to use. In a barbaric society, they'd put me to death. But in this society, they locked me up. I forget the exact quote, but
Yeah. Well, I
I
was
thought that
actually
was
remembering something you had told me with respects to, I think it was Hemingway, or I forgot which author. Down and Out in, remind me.
Paris and London. That'd be George
Or
Orwell.
right, Orwell. My bad. Completely mucked that up. I'm a bit tired. But how the poor people who they couldn't get proper sleep, they were sort of looked down upon because they were seen as useless wretches. They couldn't do anything, uh, with no sense of sympathy or empathy, and they couldn't sleep. That was probably the reason why why they
Right, because
couldn't.
of the vagrancy laws.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So like they had to move out of where they were because of vagrancy laws, and so they couldn't get a good night's sleep. And so if you're constantly sleep deprived, you're not going to be able to work at your fullest potential. And keeping a job when you're not allowed to sleep is kind of difficult.
yeah.
I think you can. speak to that. But
Yeah, it's hard. It's I mean, yeah, it's hard. But I should also mention that when I finally began to just sort of accept things as they are, it certainly didn't cure me of insomnia, but the condition tended to get better overall. When you
I,
stop being combative with yourself and with reality, a lot of things can improve.
and you recline into your mind and you relax a little more and things come a little easier. Yeah, I just definitely. I think that's a good way to be.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so there was something else I was gonna say, but I forgot what it was going to say. Something about the hamster thing that you'd
Oh
brought up.
yeah, me as a
The
child drowning the hamster. Yeah.
yeah, the bad kernel that people have, I think is how you said it
Yeah.
when we were talking earlier. That there's a kind of sadistic curiosity, if you want to call it that, in children, and you don't know what's going to happen when you do certain things, and you have to explore. And sometimes a child will poke things and do things which we would consider sadistic, but they're still trying to figure out the world. And so, I mean, there's a lot going on there, and you're subject to environmental factors. And if you're subject to environmental factors that push you in a certain direction, and you don't have control over, yeah, there go you, but for the grace of God. And when I say that, I refer back to what you were saying about the astrology or the old, antiquity tradition which led to the Stoicism. When I say there go I, but for the grace of God, I mean there go I, but for the lottery of
Yeah. Yeah.
of
Well,
happenstance
I
of
think
birth.
the incident, of me essentially, well, I drowned a hamster when I was younger. What is indicative, I think I could have easily, had I not had favorable circumstances, turned into a serial killer. It's quite possible. It seems in my current state to be impossible. Yeah, so I went through X, Y, and Z and did this and did that, and so no, no, and so, but
Right, but how many people could admit that? I mean, so many people are so sententious that they'll say, "Oh, you shouldn't have done that," and I'm so much better than you because I
well, I
don't
don't think I
drown
should have done it
rodents.
retrospect. If I mean, if I could go back in time,
Well, you know that now.
yeah. But I mean, this is another thing that the idea of regret, right? This is very much related. We the other day you're chastising yourself for not getting enough done, but I mean, this argument seems to me akin to saying something such as, well, a moose could be a Labrador Retriever if only the moose had floppy ears, canines, and a tail prone to wagging. I mean, it's just, if you were a different person, someone with a different set of biology, environment, etc., then yeah, you would be doing something else, obviously. So, and this applies to everything. And in the case of the hamster, yeah, I mean, it shows that somewhere in me, I had, or probably still have, potential for sort of sadism and torture, and it's
But
not a pleasant
ve-
thing.
very few people who are, I guess, unawares or unwilling or delusional, they would never admit that. I mean, they would take the moral high ground and they would say, "You're crazy. You've got something wrong with you. I mean, you're
Uh,
average."
well, I don't well, look. I'm not pleased with what I did when I was a child, but I wouldn't call it an aberrancy so much as a potential that many and perhaps all of us ultimately have. As I was bringing up before, not but a few generations ago, people were doing quote unquote civilized, absolutely horrific things. I mean, saying the rape of Nanking, uh, killing people willy nilly, shoving swords up women's vaginas, uh, mowing down children. This was not too long ago. The idea that we're somehow immune to this, that we couldn't possibly do this. Now, it seems so far removed given where we're sitting and standing now, right? But I can look back at that event and I can actually give a similar. I didn't actually do anything, but when I was a teenager, I used to have a cat, and the cat sometimes annoyed the hell out of me. And now I never acted upon this, But sometimes I literally wanted to grab the cat by the neck and strangle it. I never did it. I restrained myself, but there was an inclination, shut up. The meowing is driving me crazy.
Yeah,
And then looking,
I think everyone has those kind of thoughts. Everyone has some kind of,
maybe,
I
maybe
guess,
not. I think most people probably do. I talk to, I even can recognize me now. I talk to a guy sometimes who has an aged and adult cat that over Skype, I can hear them meowing all the time. And it brings back these memories and it drives me crazy. And how he just tolerates it without any problem is beyond me. I mean, I guess he's more patient than I am, but
well, I didn't mean specifically cats. I meant dark thoughts in general.
yeah, yeah. But I was just using an example that you learn, you can learn restraint. But I just my point is that there is a potential to do bad things. I think in most of us, and whether that potential is capitalized on, that's going to really depend, I think, in largest measure on environment. Obviously, the genetics are going to contribute to the degree of potential. Maybe I think, yeah, probably maybe I'm somewhat less inclined than some people to be a serial killer, but I think the potential is absolutely there had I undergone a different life and a different set of experiences. I come from a middle class New York City household, but what if I had been born in, the ghetto slums of Mumbai? I don't know. I mean, it's just who knows?
You'd probably be a child soldier, and
Yeah,
you'd probably have killed plenty of people by now.
yeah. I mean, who actually knows this? But the important thing is to admit that we don't have, at least in a factual reality based sense, a right, if you want to call it that, to engage in moral proselytizing when the person you're looking at, had you had his neurology and his circumstances, that would be you. You would be the killer. You'd be the bad guy, the guy who stole the loaf of bread. You would be whatever you're looking at and decrying. That would be you if you had, well, his genetics, his biology, and his environment, or
And
hers.
only once you really look at it can you see if you can do anything about it. If there's anything
Yeah,
causal
exactly. I
that
mean, one thing, looking back on, say, the incident of drowning the hamster, regrettable as it was, it helps put things in perspective. And one thing I think is very pertinent to MGTOW related topics is, to often talk about the anger phase, but for me, I don't just apply this to women. It's hard for me to be angry at anything, and specifically anyone, precisely for all the reasons we've talked about. I mean, I certainly understand, for example, female behavior, but I feel no anger towards it. I mean, the women are, they're doing their thing because biology and environment too.
yeah,
Uh,
and you could only attribute culpability to them if you thought it was.
but I think a lot of people still do that, and I mean, obviously, this might draw some people's ire, but you know, the problem is when we're forced to use conventional terms of language like personal responsibility and stuff. I mean, it's useful in some sense, but I mean, once again, bringing up, say, Robert Harris or any of these events, we can recognize things as harmful without attributing degrees of responsibility or culpability to them. I think. I mean, we can bypass that aspect because it's unnecessary. It's just baggage.
And I think that's the important theme of this discussion, and why it's important because we're finding cons, and I guess that there's, I still want to be part of the camp that says we have lots of agency and we can do all these kinds of things. It's difficult for me still, as I mentioned before, but this conversation I think is a bulwark against that kind of hyper agency that people tend to have, or the sense that we are the authors of ourselves.
Yeah, and
And
it's a very, as I said, it's a very modern thing. I mean, the ancients, whatever their flaws, they knew that they were subject to things greater than themselves. Yeah.
It is perhaps, as Nietzsche said, the hangover of Christian morality that we're dealing with, and the
I hate to
dualism.
say it, at least in the West, it seems to be. I mean, the whole a lot of this came about in an effort, the endless tautologies of theologians. So they have this fictitious God figure, and of course exists outside of all of this, and so you have to the correct question of good and evil, right? And which is a really boring thing to talk about. It's been talked about a million times, but because it also presupposes the existence of a God, nonetheless the only way to get around that is to make up something such as men have free will and they can exercise whether or not it creates just a view of the world, and even people who are quote unquote humanists, who aren't particularly religious, and we've inherited this view of the world of we make choices, we're free to do what we want, and we are ultimately responsible for who we are and what we do. But this is a relatively new way of looking at the world, and I think, yeah, in a large measure, it's it comes from Judeo-Christianity, although it's kind of a mixed message. I mean, if you look at parts of the Bible, many of you might be familiar with the trials of Job, right? And the lesson we're to learn from the book of Job is that you're familiar with Job. If not, I can.
Is he the one that wanted to sacrifice his son for God? Is that?
Well, that was I believe Isaac, but it
Oh,
was
sorry.
there was another Job. Job was basically a dude who kind of was Satan goes up to God and says, I bet
Oh, right, right.
I
Yes.
bet if
Sorry.
we
Continue.
put this guy under a lot of stress and give him problems, man, he's gonna swear off of you. And he said, "Oh, I don't believe that. We'll see." And so he basically runs Job through the every trial you can imagine, makes his life miserable, lose crops, people die, blah blah blah. And it's sort of a lesson in blind faith. But there's a part of that is sometimes interpreted as there's just a lot of shit going on beyond our control. So the message, I mean, the Bible is cobbled together by different people, and so in this case, it's a bit contradictory. But at least from the theological perspective, this idea of sort of man having free will is a pretty strong one, and it's kind of infected the way we think and perceive the world, and it's ultimately a damaging and a more harmful than beneficial view of the world, and an inaccurate one, most importantly. Yeah.
So I think if we can wrap this up, I'd like to return to the original question, which
Yep.
was, why do you do this? Like, what drives you?
Why do I do this? Well, man, if only we knew, not non-self cause that I am. Well, I personally think that there are things in that we can know that can be known, things that we can learn about ourselves that will improve our lives. But it's just, to me, it's a terrible feeling to be wrong. And then when I am wrong, I want to correct myself. And then if you extrapolate that onto all of these people out there believing a fiction about the nature of reality in themselves, not specific. I'm not talking about religion here. We're talking about the basically free will mythology. I feel that it would benefit them to be disabused of this. It's as I said, it's such a harmful fiction. It's so mendacious and pervasive, and I want to understand the world. I want to, I guess, cure ignorance. I want to cure my own ignorance, and maybe I'm a bit zealous in trying to cure other people's ignorance. But this in this particular topic, yeah, absolutely. This is why I do this. It needs it. I think we could have a better world, not a perfect one by any means, but we could actually discuss what's actually relevant if we could move past the rubble of this free will delusion, which, by the way, is a
Right.
very good book by William B. Miles. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. The Free Will Delusion. A bit moralizing, but it's still a good book, so I'd recommend that. Do you have anything else that you'd like to add? before
No,
we?
I think in closing, I'd say I would only repeat that once you are able to ask the questions, once you're able to say I don't know, and then to look for the real cause of things as opposed to I know and I am the cause of things. Once you disabuse yourself of this delusion, then some very interesting conversations can open up, and the way can be made for some real effect that can be had, and yeah, a better society, I'd say, like like you're going for.
And personally, and on a personal level, and we can just feel better about ourselves. We can castigate ourselves less. We can blame ourselves a lot. We don't need to blame ourselves at all. We can. There's a power behind acceptance, but acceptance can only come when we realize that things must be accepted because the combativeness can't cure it. I mean, you can't fight the gods. I mean, on a final note, I've been asked a million times, what do I mean? I'm always talking about the gods. Well, let me tell you for one final time, in all its glory, and explain what I mean. When I speak of the gods, I am talking about all those things that lead up to us being what we are. The biology, the environment, the lottery of life. That's what I'm referring to. The gods are the lottery. All the random stuff, the things that we have no control over. When I say, may the gods be with you, that means I hope that you have fortune befall you as opposed to misfortune. Because, we're continually running on this lottery ticket until it ends via death. And at any given moment, the ticket could be a loss, a partial win, jackpot, or anything in between. And so that's what I mean by the gods. So there you have it.
Well, I hope this was a great discussion for you. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely. And I'm gonna try to get High Lord Biochemist on for other things. He's talked. I've mentioned this prior as well. So the Sapolsky stuff lectures, primatologist who studies stress and in particular he studied baboons. Really interesting stuff, and I think we could probably get an interesting talk going on that topics as well at some point in time.
Definitely, definitely. I had a blast. It was fun.
Okay. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching, and now may the gods be with you.